On a morning in May 2015, guests at a five-star hotel in Zurich, Switzerland, were woken up by American federal agents knocking on their hotel room doors before breakfast. They were not drug traffickers nor ordinary fugitives. They were soccer executives, federation presidents, vice presidents of FIFA itself, arrested in their pajamas, some of them still barefoot, while the world discovered in real time that the organization responsible for the most beloved sport on the planet had, for decades, been run like a sophisticated machine for bribery, money laundering, and vote buying. In the two previous videos on this channel, you saw how FIFA builds billion-dollar profit hidden behind the label of non-profit, and how it protects that empire through an almost absolute monopoly over language and brand. Now we are going to open the darkest door in that same house. How that gigantic financial machine was, for decades, sustained and supercharged by a parallel system of corruption involving suitcases of cash, secret offshore accounts, and the literal purchase of the right to host the most watched tournament in the world. Because here is what directly connects this video to the previous two. The money we saw flowing through broadcasting, sponsorship, and brand licensing did not appear by accident, nor did it grow in a purely organic way. In a significant share of the most important decisions in the tournament's recent history, illegal money changed hands before a single ball was even kicked, buying votes, buying silence, and buying the very right to decide where and how this entire empire would be built. Throughout this video, you are going to learn about the collapse of one of the most powerful men in world sports. You are going to understand how a simple marketing company became the center of a bribery scheme that lasted decades. You are going to discover how two countries managed, according to federal investigations, to literally buy the right to host two consecutive World Cups, and you are going to meet the whistleblowers who, from inside the system itself, helped bring down much of this structure. And just like in the previous videos, we are going to arrive at a conclusion that may no longer surprise you that much. Even after arrests, prosecutions, billion-dollar fines, and solemn promises of reform, the pattern of concentrated power, financial opacity, and a real absence of external oversight that allowed this corruption remains, for the most part, intact. It is worth highlighting, before we move forward, that the total estimated value involved in this scheme, adding up direct bribes, irregular commissions, and artificially inflated contracts over more than 2 decades, exceeds, according to conservative estimates from federal investigators, more than $200 million in documented payments, and that number probably represents only the fraction that actually left a traceable banking record, not the full reality of what truly changed hands over all those years. To understand why this number, gigantic as it is probably conservative, we need to go back to the very beginning, the day the FBI decided to raid World Soccer. To understand the scale of what happened that morning in Zurich, it helps to remember that FIFA was never formally an American organization, nor strictly a European one. It is a private entity headquartered in Switzerland, overseeing a sport that, historically in the United States, never had the popularity it has in other countries. So why exactly was it the American Department of Justice, and not a Swiss or European prosecutor, that led the operation that shook world soccer? The answer lies in a piece of legal engineering called extraterritorial jurisdiction. American investigators were able to show that a significant portion of the suspicious financial transactions, bank transfers, dollar-denominated accounts, movements through American financial institutions passed at some point through the United States banking system. That alone was enough to open a federal investigation under American bank fraud and money laundering laws, even though the crimes themselves had largely taken place outside American territory. The operation, the product of a years-long internal investigation, culminated in the arrest of multiple soccer federation executives from across the Americas, most of them staying at the same luxury hotel in Zurich during FIFA's own annual meeting. The timing was not accidental. Authorities knew exactly where to find, all at once, much of their list of main suspects, all voluntarily gathered in the same place, expecting to discuss official sports business. Think about the irony of that for a moment. The same executives who, year after year, met to decide the commercial and sporting fate of billions of fans around the world were arrested precisely during one of those very meetings, turning what should have been a moment of institutional prestige into one of the most humiliating moments in the history of world sports. The formal charges included fraud, money laundering, and organized crime, with one particularly revealing detail. Prosecutors were not just going after isolated individuals, they were describing, across hundreds of pages of court documents, a structural system of corruption that had become, according to the indictment itself, practically the normal way of doing business inside certain regional soccer federations over a period of more than 2 decades. That detail is crucial for understanding the rest of this video. We are not talking about 1 or 2 isolated corrupt executives acting on their own. We are talking about an entire institutional culture, built and maintained across generations, in which accepting money in exchange for votes, contracts, and decisions was treated internally as a normal and expected part of how the system worked. It is also worth noting the immediate impact these arrests had on the financial market connected to world soccer. Global sponsors, within days, began publicly reassessing their contracts with the organization, some temporarily suspending advertising campaigns associated with the FIFA brand while they waited for more clarity on the real scope of the scandal. This kind of immediate market reaction in the face of any sign of systemic corruption inside an organization that moves billions in sponsorship illustrates how reputation and cash flow are always deeply intertwined, even when the organization in question officially operates as a nonprofit entity. And the question that naturally arises after seeing the scale of these arrests is simple. At the top of this entire structure, there was a man who, according to many investigators and sports journalists, presided over the organization during much of the period when this system flourished, without ever being formally convicted of direct personal corruption. It is exactly about this figure and about how he managed to stay in power for so long that we are going to talk now. For nearly 2 decades, a single man presided over FIFA with a level of control that few leaders of any international organization have ever achieved. He took office promising to expand soccer into regions historically neglected by professional sports. And in many ways, he kept that promise, taking the tournament to countries in Africa and Asia for the first time in history. But over that same period, his leadership also coincided exactly with the years when the corruption scheme described by American investigators flourished inside the organization he ran. The central paradox of his leadership is this: he was never formally convicted in a criminal court of direct personal corruption related to the bribery schemes investigated by the FBI. And at the same time, he was banned from world soccer for years by FIFA's own internal ethics committee over a separate and suspicious financial transaction involving a payment of millions of dollars to another major figure in the sport, classified by the committee as unethical and improperly documented. Think about what that reveals about the power structure inside the organization. The man who presided over FIFA during the most corrupt years of its recent history ended up being removed not over the most serious accusations of international money laundering, but over a separate and far less spectacular payment, which, ironically, was uncovered precisely because the entire structure was already under intense investigation. This illustrates an important principle about how institutional corruption systems actually tend to collapse. It is rarely the most serious accusation that brings down the leader at the top. It is almost always a secondary detail uncovered as a byproduct of a larger investigation that creates the legal or political opening needed to finally remove him, even when everyone already suspected the existence of far deeper problems. During his years in power, He carefully cultivated political alliances with regional executives around the world, particularly in regions where voting power within the FIFA Congress was concentrated in fewer hands. Those same regional executives, incidentally, would go on to appear repeatedly in the corruption investigations, suggesting that part of his longevity in power depended exactly on the same network of relationships that, simultaneously, sustained the broader bribery scheme. It is worth noting that he always denied any direct knowledge of the corruption schemes that flourished under his leadership, claiming that the scale of the organization made it impossible to personally monitor every decision made by every regional federation around the world. It is a defense that, curiously, repeats itself in practically every large-scale corporate scandal. The leader at the top claims to have no direct knowledge of what happened several levels below him, even when the financial and political benefits of that scheme ultimately flowed toward the stability of his own administration. And perhaps the most revealing detail in this entire story is the following. Even after being banned, he never publicly returned a single dollar related to the years of systemic corruption documented by investigators. And he continued for years, defending his own legacy as the man who globalized soccer, largely ignoring the institutional and financial cost of that very same period. There is also a personal dimension to this story that often goes unnoticed. Throughout his years in power, he traveled extensively around the world, always received with the honors of a head of state by governments interested in hosting future editions of the tournament or in maintaining good relations with the organization he ran. This kind of protocol treatment, normally reserved for democratically elected political leaders, illustrates the level of informal influence a single sports executive managed to accumulate, simply by controlling access to an event capable of generating billions in tourism and advertising revenue for any host country. But the scheme that sustained all those years did not depend on just one man at the top. It depended on a specific commercial machine with an almost generic name that operated for decades as the invisible engine behind much of the corruption under investigation. There is a name that appears repeatedly in practically every court document related to the American investigation into soccer corruption. A sports marketing company specializing in negotiating and reselling broadcasting and sponsorship rights for soccer competitions around the world, particularly in Latin America and Central America. According to the investigations, this company was not simply buying and reselling commercial rights legitimately. It was, according to American prosecutors, systematically paying bribes to regional federation executives in exchange for guarantees that it would secure the most lucrative broadcasting and sponsorship contracts, effectively eliminating any real competition for those rights. Think about how this scheme worked in practice. Instead of competing openly, offering the best price for the broadcasting rights of a regional tournament, the company simply paid, under the table, directly to the executives who had decision-making power over who would win those contracts. The result was doubly advantageous for the company. It secured the rights for less than it would have paid in a genuinely competitive market, and it also guaranteed through the bribes the continued loyalty of those same executives for future deals. This business model, based on eliminating competition through illegal payments instead of genuinely competing on quality or price, is a pattern that appears repeatedly in corporate corruption scandals around the world, not just in soccer. The difference in the case of Latin American and Caribbean soccer is the scale and the duration. The scheme, according to the investigations, lasted decades, involving sums that, added up over time, reached hundreds of millions of dollars in irregular payments. And here is a particularly revealing detail about how this kind of scheme stays hidden for so long. The legitimate commercial contracts with publicly declared official values served as the perfect facade to hide the parallel payments. Anyone looking from the outside would see only a legitimate sports marketing company negotiating legitimate commercial rights, with no visible indication that underneath this seemingly normal structure, there was an entire second layer of undeclared payments. This pattern of using legitimate contracts as a facade for illegal payments is, in fact, one of the most common money laundering techniques in any sector of the economy, not just in sports. The financial lesson worth taking from this is that the presence of formal contracts with seemingly solid and auditable numbers does not by itself guarantee that the entire transaction is legitimate. Sometimes the visible contract exists precisely to hide what is happening underneath it. Another important detail revealed by the investigations is that this same marketing company over the years expanded its operations into multiple countries and multiple regional competitions, replicating the same model of irregular payments in each new market it managed to control. This pattern of geographically expanding a successful corruption scheme, applying the same formula repeatedly across different territories, resembles how any legitimate business scales its operations, with the obvious difference that, in this case, the product being replicated and sold was essentially corrupt access to commercial decisions that should have been made competitively and transparently. And when investigators began tracing the money behind this company, they did not find just one isolated scheme. They found an entire network of regional executives, particularly concentrated within a single continental confederation that, according to the indictment, operated as a true corruption cartel inside soccer itself. Within FIFA's structure, the world is divided into continental confederations, each responsible for organizing regional competitions and representing member countries' interests within the organization's global congress. And it was inside one of these confederations, responsible for soccer across North America, Central America, and the Caribbean, that investigators found what many described as the deepest and oldest core of the systemic corruption scheme. Over decades, according to the formal indictment presented by the American Department of Justice, a succession of presidents and executives from this regional confederation built a practically institutionalized system of bribery, receiving irregular payments in exchange for decisions about tournament hosting, broadcasting rights, sponsorships, and even votes within FIFA's own internal elections. Think about the specific financial engineering that made this scheme sustainable for so long. The payments were not made directly into visible personal accounts under the executives' own names. They flowed through a complex web of offshore accounts, shell companies registered across multiple countries, and financial intermediaries that deliberately made it difficult to trace the money back to its origin or its final destination. One of the most central figures in this investigation, after being confronted with overwhelming evidence gathered by American investigators, decided to formally cooperate with the justice system, becoming one of the most important sources of internal information about how the scheme actually worked over decades. This kind of cooperation, in exchange for reduced sentences, is a classic tool in organized crime and large-scale corruption investigations, allowing prosecutors to build much stronger cases against the executives who remain at the top of the hierarchy. This executives' cooperation revealed details that, until then, had only been suspicions. Meetings where cash was literally handed over in envelopes, hosting decisions that were made weeks before any formal vote because the votes had already been bought, and a system of reciprocal favors among regional executives that extended far beyond American and Caribbean soccer, reaching decisions within FIFA at the global level. This kind of structure, in which formally democratic decisions with secret ballots and seemingly transparent procedures actually hide a predetermined outcome bought through prior payments, is one of the most sophisticated forms of institutional corruption that exist, because it preserves the entire external appearance of procedural legitimacy while completely hollowing out the real substance of that same internal democracy. It is worth noting that this same regional confederation, after the collapse of the original scheme, went through multiple changes in leadership in fairly quick succession, with several consecutive presidents being removed or investigated over similar allegations of financial misconduct. This pattern of repeated leadership instability even after a massive and widely publicized scandal, suggests that the underlying institutional culture that allowed decades of systemic corruption does not automatically dissolve just because the individuals at the top are replaced. The system itself needs to be redesigned, not just its leadership figures. And it is exactly this kind of seemingly legitimate but potentially money-compromised voting process that brings us to the most controversial chapter in this entire story: the decisions about who would host the two most debated World Cups in the tournament's recent history. In December 2010, the FIFA Congress announced on the same day the hosts for two future editions of the World Cup. One was awarded to a European country with a vast soccer tradition, but with climate and infrastructure already well suited to the sport. The other was awarded to a small Middle Eastern country with summer temperatures regularly exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, no existing stadium meeting the tournament's required standard, and no significant historical tradition in top-level men's soccer. The decision over that second host generated almost immediately a level of public questioning rarely seen for any previous hosting decision. Journalists, former sports executives, and eventually federal investigators from multiple countries began closely examining exactly how that country secured the necessary votes within FIFA's executive committee, especially given the obvious climate and structural challenges that even a minimally informed person could already identify before the vote even took place. Subsequent investigations revealed a pattern of financial relationships between representatives linked to the winning bid and specific members of the executive committee responsible for the vote, including payments, high-value gifts, and commercial benefits granted to companies linked to some of those voters in periods close to the final hosting decision. Think about the financial scale involved in this specific decision. The right to host a World Cup is not just about sporting prestige. It involves billion-dollar infrastructure construction, long-term tourism, and hospitality contracts. And, as we saw in the first video in this series, long-term strategic positioning within the global entertainment and sports economy. Buying that kind of decision, even indirectly through a complex network of favors and payments, represents a potentially enormous return on investment, even accounting for the costs involved in any irregular influence scheme. The executive committee responsible for that specific vote was made up of a relatively small number of people, typically around 24 voters, representing different regional confederations from around the world. This detail is crucial for understanding why this kind of scheme was, in practice, viable. Convincing or buying the loyalty of a relatively small and concentrated group of voters is a logistically far simpler task than trying to influence an election with millions of voters, as happens in traditional national political processes. Several members of that same executive committee who took part in that specific vote would go on in subsequent years to face their own separate corruption charges, sports bans, or even criminal proceedings related to other schemes investigated by American and Swiss authorities, raising serious questions about the overall integrity of the voting process that day, not just about that one isolated decision. It is also worth remembering that the formal bidding process for hosting the tournament requires each competing country to produce a detailed technical dossier evaluating existing infrastructure, hotel capacity, transportation systems, and even average climate conditions during the planned period of the matches. In the case of the winning Middle Eastern bid, that same technical dossier, according to later analyses by sports infrastructure experts, received internal evaluations significantly lower than those of the defeated competing bids, which made the final outcome even harder to explain based solely on objective technical criteria. And that was not the only hosting decision under investigation during that same period. The choice of the other country would also come under close scrutiny for somewhat different reasons, but equally concerning ones. While the decision over the Middle Eastern country dominated international headlines for obvious climate and structural reasons, The choice of the European country to host the earlier edition of the tournament also came under close investigation by the same authorities, for financial reasons similar to those already discussed earlier in this video. Investigators examined allegations that representatives linked to that country's winning bid had also established strategic financial relationships with members of the same executive committee responsible for the vote, including favorable commercial deals involving companies and individuals close to some of those voters in the months leading up to the final decision. Think about the revealing coincidence here. The two most controversial hosting decisions in the tournament's recent history were announced on the exact same day by the same executive committee, and both later became the target of separate federal investigations into possible vote buying. That is not necessarily automatic proof that both decisions were corrupted in the same way or to the same degree, but it raises a much broader structural question about the entire voting process used by FIFA during that specific period of its history. FIFA itself, pressured by the scale of these investigations, eventually hired an independent investigator to produce an internal report on possible irregularities in the voting process for both hosting decisions. The final report, however, generated its own separate controversy. The very investigator hired to produce the document publicly disagreed, after its publication, with how FIFA summarized and released his conclusions, claiming the organization had distorted or downplayed important findings from his original work. This kind of conflict between an investigator and the organization under investigation is, on its own, a classic warning sign in any corporate governance process. When the entity under investigation completely controls how and whether the results of that very investigation are publicly released, there is an obvious structural incentive to minimize or reframe uncomfortable conclusions, even when the original investigation was conducted with genuine rigor. Despite all this controversy, neither hosting decision was ever formally reversed or repeated through a new vote. Both tournaments went ahead as planned in the dates and countries originally decided, despite years of investigations, allegations, and reports questioning the legitimacy of the process that led to those decisions. That detail on its own may be one of the most revealing in this entire story, even when there is substantial evidence suggesting that a decision-making process was compromised by corruption. The logistical, financial, and contractual magnitude of simply undoing that decision after years of planning, construction, and already signed contracts becomes so large that in practice, reversing the decision becomes nearly impossible, regardless of how strong the evidence uncovered afterward turns out to be. Another aspect rarely discussed publicly is that, after both controversial decisions were announced, several European and American governments opened their own parallel investigations independent of the original American federal investigation, examining whether companies and banks registered in their respective territories had been used to facilitate suspicious payments related to both winning bids. This multiplication of simultaneous investigations across different countries illustrates how international corruption schemes, precisely because they involve financial transactions crossing multiple borders, often attract scrutiny from several distinct authorities at the same time, each one analyzing the same network of payments from within its own national legal system. And this pattern of irregular money changing hands before major decisions was not limited to the choice of hosts. It also showed up in less publicly discussed ways within seemingly smaller but financially significant decisions about officiating and the outcomes of specific matches. Beyond administrative and hosting vote corruption, parallel investigations conducted by sports integrity organizations and police authorities in multiple countries revealed a separate but related problem: schemes to manipulate the outcomes of specific matches, particularly in qualifying competitions and international friendlies that receive less monitoring from the global media. This kind of manipulation generally works through sports betting, a global market that moves hundreds of billions of dollars annually, legal in many countries and completely illegal, but widely practiced anyway in many others. Criminal organizations specializing in betting manipulation identify matches with a low level of public scrutiny, often involving smaller national teams or lower-tier competitions, and offer payments to players, referees, or even executives at smaller national federations in exchange for specific results or for seemingly small details within a match, such as the exact number of yellow cards issued, which directly affect certain types of specialized sports betting. Think about the global scale of this specific problem. Unlike high-level administrative corruption, which involves a relatively small number of powerful executives, match manipulation can, theoretically, involve any one of the thousands of games played around the world every year in practically any country, making the problem extremely difficult to monitor and fight in a centralized and effective way. FIFA currently maintains an internal unit dedicated exclusively to monitoring suspicious betting patterns related to soccer matches around the world, using algorithms that detect abnormal betting patterns as an early warning sign of possible manipulation. But the real effectiveness of this unit, according to independent sports integrity experts, remains limited by the absolute scale of the problem and by the practical difficulty of criminally prosecuting schemes that frequently cross multiple national jurisdictions, each with completely different legal and police systems. This kind of corruption, at the level of the game itself, is particularly corrosive to public trust in the sport, because it directly attacks the most basic premise of any sporting competition: the idea that the outcome on the field genuinely reflects the performance of the athletes involved, and not a financial agreement decided in advance, out of sight of the public that is paying to watch, to bet, or simply to emotionally root for a result they believe to be genuine. And here is the direct connection to the rest of this video. The same institutional environment of weak oversight, opaque financial decisions, and a historical absence of rigorous external audits that allowed decades of administrative corruption at the top of the pyramid also creates the ideal structural conditions for this kind of manipulation to happen without serious consequences in the lower and less visible layers of the same global sporting system. There is also an additional layer to this problem that rarely receives attention proportional to its real size: sports betting, involving inside information about player injuries, tactical lineups, or internal decisions made by coaching staffs, improperly shared by club and federation insiders with professional bettors in exchange for discrete payments. This specific type of manipulation is particularly hard to detect and prosecute because it does not necessarily require anyone to deliberately alter the outcome of a match. It only requires leaking privileged information that gives a bettor a significant informational advantage over the rest of the market. But just like the administrative corruption investigated by the FBI, this entire system eventually began to collapse, not because of a spontaneous internal reform, but because people from inside the system itself decided, for different reasons, to cooperate with outside investigators. No institutional corruption scheme of this scale and duration survives without a significant number of people inside the organization itself, knowing exactly what is happening. The question is never really whether internal witnesses exist. The question is whether and when one of them decides to break the silence and cooperate with outside investigators. One of the most central figures in this entire investigation, after years of being quietly monitored by American tax authorities over completely separate issues related to undeclared taxes on his own personal income, eventually agreed to fully cooperate with federal investigators, providing detailed information about decades of irregular payments in exchange for a reduced sentence for the very tax crimes that originally put him under investigation. Think about the structural irony of this situation. The most heavily investigated sports corruption scheme in recent soccer history began to collapse, not because of a direct investigation into sports corruption, but because of a completely separate tax investigation over undeclared personal income, which, as an unplanned byproduct, ended up revealing the entire broader structure of bribery and money laundering hidden behind it. This pattern repeats itself with surprising frequency in major institutional corruption cases around the world, not just in soccer. Often, it is not the direct investigation into the main crime that brings down the scheme. It is a parallel investigation into a seemingly smaller and more technical problem, like personal tax evasion, that creates the opening investigators' need to start pulling the thread that eventually unravels the entire larger structure behind it. This particular executive's detailed cooperation, including recorded conversations, internal financial records, and direct testimony about meetings where corrupt decisions were made, gave American prosecutors exactly the kind of detailed internal evidence that is normally extremely difficult to obtain in international corruption investigations, where most of the financial evidence is hidden behind international banking secrecy and complex corporate structures spread across multiple jurisdictions. Other executives, seeing the strength of the evidence already gathered by investigators, also chose to cooperate, creating a cascade effect where each new collaboration provided additional evidence that made it increasingly difficult for the remaining executives to deny knowledge of or involvement in the broader scheme. And here is an important lesson about how institutional corruption systems actually collapse in practice. They rarely fall all at once through a single dramatic revelation. They unravel gradually through a sequence of individual collaborations, each motivated by self-interest and not always purely ethical reasons, like reduced sentences or personal protection, which, added together, eventually reveal the full structure of the scheme to investigators and to the public at large. It is also worth noting that several of the executives who chose to cooperate continued in parallel, facing civil lawsuits filed by FIFA itself, which was seeking to recover part of the money diverted over the years, even while those same executives were actively helping federal prosecutors build criminal cases against other members of the scheme. This dual front, criminal cooperation on one side and a civil dispute over money on the other, shows how recovering diverted funds in institutional corruption schemes tends to be a long, fragmented, and rarely fully complete process, even when cooperation with investigators is total. After all this public collapse, FIFA itself, under new leadership, promised a complete and definitive reform of the organization. The question that needs to be asked now is, did that reform actually solve the structural problem, or did it just change the external appearance of the same power structure? After the wave of arrests, prosecutions, and bans that shook the organization, new leadership took over FIFA, promising exactly what the public and sponsors most wanted to hear: radical transparency, modern corporate governance, and a definitive end to the culture of corruption that had dominated previous decades of the organization. Among the main changes announced were term limits for leadership positions, public disclosure of senior executive salaries, previously treated as an absolute secret, the creation of independent audit and compliance committees, and supposedly stricter new rules for the process of choosing future tournament hosts, including formal technical evaluations and comparative scoring among competing bids. Think for a moment about how these reforms were received by specialized media and international corporate governance experts. The initial reaction was one of cautious, mixed with some optimism, acknowledging that at least some real structural changes were being implemented, but raising legitimate doubts about whether those changes would be enough to genuinely alter the deeper institutional culture that had allowed decades of systemic corruption. And those doubts, as the years went by, proved to a significant extent justified. Despite the new formal rules on technical evaluation of bids, subsequent decisions about future tournament hosts continued to generate controversy, with critics pointing out that political and commercial factors still seem to weigh more heavily than objective technical criteria in at least some of these decisions, even within the new, supposedly more transparent system. It is also worth highlighting that the new organization president's own salary, publicly disclosed as part of the transparency reforms, generated considerable debate for representing a value significantly higher than what leaders of comparable international sports organizations received, raising questions about whether transparency was being genuinely used to promote accountability or simply to publicly legitimize financial decisions that, in essence, continued concentrating significant resources at the top of the organizational hierarchy. This pattern, in which reforms announced in response to public scandals end up changing formal and visible procedures without necessarily altering the real distribution of power and money within an organization, is extremely common in major corporations and institutions going through reputation crises around the world, not just in soccer. Formal transparency on its own, without deeper structural changes in decision-making power concentration, often serves more to restore public trust and commercial credibility for the organization than to actually prevent future corruption schemes. This does not necessarily mean that no real improvement has happened. More formal audit mechanisms and an organizational culture more aware of the risk of public exposure and international criminal investigation probably make certain specific types of corruption riskier and harder to carry out today than they were during the years investigated by the FBI. But the fundamental structure of concentrated power, financial decisions with little independent external oversight, and the absence of any truly external and impartial regulatory body supervising the organization as a whole remains, in essence, practically unchanged. There is also a telling detail about how the sponsorship market reacted to these announced reforms. Despite the entire scandal, and despite the doubts raised about how deep the implemented changes actually went, the major global sponsors that had temporarily suspended their contracts at the height of the investigations, for the most part, returned normally as commercial partners of the organization in the following years. This suggests that, from a purely commercial standpoint, the reputation of a sports brand as valuable as the World Cup can survive even massive-scale corruption scandals, as long as enough time passes and new reform narratives are presented to the consuming public. And it is exactly this structural continuity behind the appearance of change that brings us to this video's final reflection: why, even after one of the largest sports corruption scandals in world history, does the fundamental pattern of concentrated power and weak oversight remain, in essence, exactly the same as always. If you watched the two previous videos in this series about FIFA's financial machine and its brand monopoly and made it this far, you now have the complete picture of how these three systems, money, brand, and institutional power, connect to and reinforce one another across decades of the tournament's history. The corruption we saw in this video is not an isolated chapter, separate from the two previous systems we already explored. It is, in fact, the fertile ground where those other two systems were able to grow without meaningful external oversight. It was exactly the absence of rigorous independent auditing and the extreme concentration of decision-making power in the hands of a relatively small number of executives that allowed both the bribery scheme we saw in this video and the financial engineering that classifies billion-dollar profit as non-profit activity and the legal brand monopoly we examined in the previous video. Think about the common structure behind all three systems. In every case, decisions with a financial impact of hundreds of millions or billions of dollars are made by a relatively small group of people with very little independent external oversight operating within a legal structure that consistently favors the organization itself, whether through tax exemptions negotiated with governments, through legal monopoly over language and brand, or through opaque voting processes vulnerable to undue financial influence. And here is, perhaps, the most important lesson from this entire series so far. Large-scale institutional corruption rarely depends on isolated villains acting alone against a well-designed oversight system. It almost always depends on poorly designed systems with weak oversight and excessive concentration of power that make corruption not just possible, but statistically almost inevitable, given enough time and opportunity. The evidence that this structure remains intact is not theoretical or historical. It is documented, recent, and happening right now, while the 2026 World Cup is being played across American stadiums. In 2026, the former president of the Republic of the Congo's Soccer Association received a life sentence in absentia for embezzling $1.1 million in FIFA development funds, the same funds officially designated to build fields, train coaches, and develop youth programs in one of the world's poorest countries. The former president of the Maldives Football Association was sentenced to 23 years in prison for misusing FIFA COVID relief money, funds originally sent to support the sport through the pandemic. And in 2025, FIFA itself was forced to ban a Venezuelan official for financial wrongdoing related to federation funds. 3 separate countries, 3 separate schemes, all of them unfolding after the supposedly comprehensive reforms of 2016. And none of them at the highest levels of the organization, which suggests these are not isolated cases of individual bad actors. They are the visible surface of a system that continues operating exactly as it always has, just with slightly more paperwork and slightly better excuses. The political mechanism at the very top of the organization tells the same story. The current FIFA president has mastered the tool that sustained corruption throughout the organization's history: the controlled distribution of development funds as a vote-buying instrument. He won his initial presidential election by promising to increase the annual payment to each of FIFA's 201 member associations by $5 million per member. After his first re-election, he increased it again. After his second re-election, he increased it again. As a third re-election campaign approached, he announced yet another increase. The development funds, which in theory exist to grow the sport in countries that need investment most, have become, in practice, the financial currency through which the president of the world's most powerful sports organization maintains the political support he needs to stay in office indefinitely. This is not a hidden detail. It is publicly documented in the organization's own announcements, visible to anyone willing to look. That lesson goes far beyond soccer. Any organization, company, government, or financial institution that concentrates significant decision-making power in the hands of a few people without robust and genuinely independent external oversight mechanisms creates the same structural conditions we have seen repeat themselves here across decades inside FIFA. The question worth taking from this series into your own financial and professional life is not just, is this person or organization honest, but rather, what kind of oversight structure actually exists here? And what would happen if the person at the top quietly decided to abuse that power? It is also worth highlighting that practically none of the billions of dollars moved irregularly throughout these decades of corruption was ever actually returned to the sport's own coffers, or significantly redistributed to the smaller communities and federations that, in theory, should have been the biggest beneficiaries of soccer's global development. The money recovered through fines and legal settlements, although substantial in absolute terms, represents a relatively small fraction of the total estimated scale of irregular payments over the decades, and much of it went toward covering the legal and administrative costs of the investigations themselves, not toward directly repairing the damage done to the sport's development in poorer regions. It is also worth remembering that this same pattern of concentrated corruption is not exclusive to soccer, nor exclusive to sports in general. Other international sports organizations responsible for other major global events have already faced remarkably similar investigations, involving vote buying for host selection, irregular payments to regional executives, and similarly, structural difficulty implementing genuinely independent external oversight. This suggests the problem is not specific to one single organization or one single sport, but rather a structural pattern that emerges whenever extremely high-value global events are run by private organizations with weak internal governance and little accountability to the public that ultimately financially sustains this entire ecosystem through its own passion for sport. And perhaps this is the most uncomfortable final finding of this entire series. Regardless of how many individual executives get arrested, fined, or banned, the deeper institutional structure that allowed decades of systemic corruption, extreme concentration of decision-making power, absence of independent external oversight, and widespread financial opacity remains, in essence, fundamentally intact, simply waiting for the next generation of executives willing to exploit it all over again. So let's bring together the three layers of this story we have built across this series. In the first video, we saw how FIFA turns popular passion into billion-dollar profit hidden under the legal label of non-profit. In the second video, we saw how it protects that empire through an almost absolute monopoly over language, image, and visual identity. And in this third video, we saw how decades of that same power structure were sustained, behind the scenes, by a parallel system of bribery, bought votes, and money laundering that only began to collapse when investigators from another country, using an almost accidental jurisdiction over international banking transactions, finally decided to dig deep. And here is the question I want to leave you with before we close this chapter. How many times in your own professional or financial life have you trusted an institution, a company, or a person in a position of authority simply because they seemed too big, too established, or too respected to be doing something wrong? Because it is exactly this kind of automatic trust based on size and prestige instead of real, verifiable oversight that allowed decades of systemic corruption inside one of the most visible and most beloved organizations on the planet. This lesson goes far beyond soccer and international scandals. Think about how many times you have invested money, signed a contract, or trusted your savings to someone without genuinely checking what kind of external oversight, independent auditing, or real transparency existed behind that person's or institution's visible reputation. Learning to separate reputation from real oversight is one of the most valuable financial skills you can develop, and that is exactly the kind of critical thinking this entire series has been trying to train with you, video after video. Perhaps the biggest contrast between these three videos is this. In the first two, we talked about systems that, while morally questionable, were technically legal, sophisticated tax and legal engineering, but still within the formal rules of the game. In this third video, we definitively crossed the line into criminal territory, bribery, money laundering, vote buying, under formal investigation by federal authorities from multiple countries. And perhaps the most important lesson is realizing how these two categories, the legal but questionable and the definitively illegal, are not separate worlds, but 2 points along the same spectrum of concentrated power and weak oversight we have examined throughout this entire series. I am not saying the entire history of world soccer is corrupt, nor that every sports executive around the world is somehow compromised. What is worth recognizing is that concentrated power structures with weak external oversight create structural conditions that make large-scale corruption not just possible, but, given enough time, statistically almost inevitable, regardless of how genuinely well-intentioned the individuals who initially take on those positions of power may be. And if there is one thing these three videos together make clear, it is that truly understanding money is never just about numbers on a spreadsheet or about genuine passion for a sport. It is about understanding structure, power, and the crucial difference between trusting reputation and genuinely verifying what kind of real oversight actually exists behind it. One last reflection before we close out this three-part series: none of the structures we examined, the financial machine, the brand monopoly, or the systemic corruption, were built overnight. Each one took decades to take shape through small decisions, small concessions, and small silences, accumulated year after year, generation after generation of executives. And perhaps that is exactly why these structures are so hard to dismantle all at once. They are not a single obvious mistake waiting to be corrected. They are thousands of small interconnected decisions, each one seeming reasonable, in isolation, at the moment it was made, that together build an entire system that, from the outside, seems almost impossible to challenge. And since we have made it this far together, across 3 entire videos in this series, which of these 3 layers impressed you the most? The financial engineering that profits billions disguised as non-profit, the almost absolute monopoly over words and images, or the scale of the systemic corruption that sustained it all for decades? Leave it in the comments, because I genuinely want to read your answer, and I want to know if, after these 3 videos, you are going to follow world soccer with different eyes. If you enjoyed understanding how financial empires get built, protected, and sometimes corrupted behind facades that seem simple, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because that is exactly this space's mission, showing what truly sustains the power, the money, and the institutions that shape the world around you, one story at a time.